Have you ever looked back at a relationship and wondered, was that normal or was something deeply wrong? Maybe at the beginning it felt like the most intense connection you had ever experienced. You felt seen, understood, chosen. But over time, something started changing. You began feeling anxious in ways you couldn't explain. You started questioning your own reactions. You started wondering if you were becoming someone you didn't recognize. And today we're going to talk about something many survivors only realize much later. The quiet signs you were in a narcissistic relationship. Because once you recognize these patterns, you may suddenly understand things that never made sense before. One of the hardest parts about narcissistic relationships is how confusing they are. Because they rarely begin in a way that feels dangerous. They begin with intensity, attention, chemistry. Sometimes it feels like you've finally met someone who truly understands you. Someone who listens, someone who seems fascinated by every detail about you. And in the beginning, that attention feels incredible. But slowly something starts shifting. You begin feeling uncertain. You begin overthinking conversations. You begin wondering if you said something wrong. And eventually, you start feeling responsible for emotions that were never yours to carry. If you've experienced this, please know something important. You're not alone. And many survivors later discover that the relationship followed patterns they couldn't see while they were inside it. So today, we're going to talk about some of the clearest signs you may have been in a narcissistic relationship. And as you listen, you might recognize moments from your own story. One of the first signs is intensity. The relationship may have moved much faster than you expected. Very early on, the connection felt unusually deep. You may have heard things like, "I've never felt this way before. You're the only person who truly understands me. I think we're meant to be together." And at the time, it feels magical. It feels like fate. But here's the part most people don't understand. Healthy relationships usually develop gradually. Trust builds over time. But narcissistic relationships often accelerate emotional closeness very quickly. Because emotional intensity can create attachment before you fully understand who the other person really is. Another sign appears when self-doubt begins growing inside the relationship. You begin questioning your reactions, your feelings, your memory. Maybe you remember a conversation clearly, but they insist it happened differently. Maybe you express hurt, but they say you're overreacting. And slowly, something very important begins shifting. And at first, that shift can feel incredibly subtle. You don't wake up one day suddenly doubting yourself. It happens in small moments, small conversations, small disagreements that leave you feeling strangely unsettled. Maybe you bring up something that hurt you. And instead of addressing what happened, the conversation turns into something else. Suddenly, you're explaining your tone, your timing, your reaction. The original issue quietly disappears. And without realizing it, you begin replaying the conversation later in your mind. You ask yourself questions like, did I say that the wrong way? Was I too emotional? Maybe I misunderstood. And the more these moments happen, the more your mind begins searching for explanations that place responsibility on you. Because believing you made a mistake sometimes feels easier than accepting a much more painful possibility. That the other person is distorting reality. Here's the part most people don't understand. When someone repeatedly redirects responsibility in this way, it slowly disrupts your internal sense of certainty. Your instincts become quieter. Your confidence in your own perception becomes weaker. And over time, something incredibly important begins fading. Your trust in yourself. That's why many survivors say the same thing when they look back on the relationship. They don't just remember the arguments, they remember the confusion, the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but they couldn't fully explain why. And that confusion can stay with someone long after the relationship ends, until one day they begin learning about these patterns, and suddenly the pieces begin coming together. The moments that once felt random start forming a very clear picture. Your confidence in your own perception. Many survivors describe this feeling the same way. They felt like they were constantly walking on eggshells. You start choosing your words carefully. You start avoiding certain topics. You try to predict their reactions before speaking. Why? Because you're trying to prevent conflict. You're trying to keep the peace. But over time, this emotional vigilance becomes exhausting because relationships are not supposed to feel like emotional minefields. Think about that for a moment. When you're with someone who genuinely cares about you, and you don't have to constantly monitor your words. You don't have to rehearse your emotions. You don't have to silence parts of yourself to avoid conflict. Healthy relationships allow emotional safety, not constant tension. Another powerful sign is blame shifting. No matter what the disagreement was about, the conversation somehow returned to you. Maybe the issue started with something they said or something they did, but by the end of the argument, you were apologizing. And this is why it hurts so much. Because over time, blame shifting doesn't just affect arguments. It slowly reshapes how you see yourself. One day, the connection feels amazing. The next day, something feels distant, cold, unpredictable. You start wondering what changed, what you did wrong, but often nothing actually changed. The emotional highs and lows themselves become part of the dynamic, and those highs can be incredibly powerful because they make you believe the relationship can return to how it felt in the beginning. Here's the part most people don't understand. Those powerful moments of affection can actually make the relationship harder to leave because they create hope. Hope that the person you saw in the beginning will return. Hope that the connection you once felt can come back. But over time, that hope can become a trap. Another quiet sign appears when you look at how the relationship changed you. Think about who you were before it began. Your confidence, your energy, your sense of identity. Now think about who you felt like near the end. Many survivors say the same thing. I stopped recognizing myself. And that transformation rarely happens overnight. It happens slowly, through criticism, through emotional withdrawal, through doubt, until your sense of self begins shrinking. Even when the relationship was painful, leaving felt incredibly difficult. You missed them. You thought about them constantly. You wanted things to go back to how they were in the beginning. This powerful attachment is often connected to something called a trauma bond, a deep emotional connection created by cycles of affection and emotional pain. And trauma bonds can make leaving feel almost impossible, even when you know the relationship is hurting you. If you recognized yourself in several of these signs, take a moment to breathe, because realizing this can bring many emotions: relief, anger, sadness, clarity, all at once. And every one of those feelings is valid. Because for many survivors, this moment of realization can feel overwhelming. You may suddenly remember conversations that once confused you, moments where something inside you felt uneasy, but you couldn't fully explain why. Times when you tried harder, loved deeper, gave more, hoping the relationship would return to how it felt in the beginning. And when those memories surface, it's natural to ask yourself difficult questions. Why didn't I see it sooner? But here's the truth many survivors eventually discover. You didn't miss the signs because you were weak. You missed them because you were hoping for love. And hope can sometimes make us stay longer than we should. But here's something important to remember. Recognizing these patterns is not a sign that you are weak. It's a sign that you are beginning to see the relationship clearly. And clarity is powerful because once you understand the patterns, you become much less vulnerable to them in the future. You begin trusting your instincts again. You begin protecting your boundaries. And slowly, your sense of self begins returning. If you are in a narcissistic relationship, please remember this. You are not naive for loving deeply. You are not foolish for believing someone could change. You are human, and humans are wired for connection. But now something important is happening. You are learning. You are understanding. And with that understanding, your power begins returning. If this video helped you recognize something about your experience, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we talk openly about narcissistic relationships, trauma bonds, and emotional recovery. Because understanding what happened to you is the first step toward reclaiming your life. And remember, you survived the relationship. Here, we help you survive it too. And if you've ever wondered something else, why did the relationship feel so intense in the beginning? The next video on this channel explains why narcissists love bomb people at the start of relationships. And once you understand that pattern, even more pieces of your story will begin making sense.